Hello and welcome to Curl Up with a Cozy Crime author. My name's Sarah Campbell and today we are talking about the life and times of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. But first, I just want to let you know that I am an author of many self-published books, including Claire's Diary, a YA mystery novel. You can also view my blog, Curl Up with a Cozy Crime Novel, where I post reviews of recent books I have read, and also you can sign up to my newsletter there. So I don't know about you, but I have always been a massive Sherlock Holmes fan. I was introduced to the books as a child, and more recently I have been rewatching the 1980s TV series starring Jeremy Brett. That is on ITVX. Since moving down south to more sunnier climes, I have enjoyed visiting Portsmouth Museum and Art Gallery. There they have an exhibition called A Study in Sherlock, which is a collection of memorabilia that was collected throughout the lifetime of Richard Llewellyn Green. Upon his death, Green bequeathed his entire collection to Portsmouth Council. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was born in Edinburgh on the 22nd of May in 1859. He grew up in relative poverty because his father, Charles, was an alcoholic. Charles would later end up in residential homes and lunatic asylums. Conan Doyle was close to his mother, Mary, and his uncles paid for him to go to school in Lancashire. When he had finished with his schooling, he went abroad for a year to Austria. Upon returning, he enrolled at the Edinburgh Medical School to study medicine. Whilst at university, Conan Doyle had his first short story, The Mystery of Southsea Valley, published. This was in 1876. The story was an adventure story set in South Africa. He also went aboard the ship The Hope as a ship's surgeon. This ship travelled to the Arctic and was a whale hunting ship. He qualified as a doctor in 1881. A friend from his university days, George Budd, offered him a post at his medical practice in Plymouth. Unfortunately, the partnership did not last more than a few months, as Budd asked him to leave. However, he said that he would loan him the money for Conan Doyle to start up his own medical practice. Conan Doyle settled in Portsmouth in 1882 and tried to establish a medical practice in Southsea. The house that he rented was called Bush Villas. Unfortunately, Budd reneged on his loan and things were very difficult in Southsea for Conan Doyle. He managed to build up his practice slowly though, and it was to be here that he would meet his first wife, Louisa, affectionately called Tui. This was after caring for her terminally ill brother. He went on to marry Louisa in 1885. Have you ever wondered where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got his idea to write Sherlock Holmes stories? Well, I researched this online on the Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia, which had an interview with Conan Doyle in later years. Conan Doyle had read several detective novels and thought that they were based upon coincidence, except for the works of Edgar Allan Poe, who he liked. He created Sherlock by thinking of his old professor at Edinburgh University, who would have thought through the case for detection in a much more logical way. There are 60 Sherlock Holmes books in total, and 56 of them are short stories. A fascinating fact is that Arthur Conan Doyle once had a meeting with a publisher and met Oscar Wilde. Following the meeting, he wrote another outing for his detective, having previously penned A Study in Scarlet. A Study in Scarlet was first seen in Beeton's Christmas Annual in 1887. Around this time, the author was also writing historical fiction with Micah Clarke, first published in 1889. The novel is set in the late 17th century about English Puritans and the Monmouth Rebellion. That second book he would go on to write was called The Sign of Four, and it was published in 1890 by Lippincott's magazine. Although Conan Doyle was to leave Southsea in 1890, he carried on for a while with his medical practice in London near the British Museum. This unfortunately wasn't successful. However, he used his free time to further the Sherlock Holmes stories. The Strand magazine, which first started publication in 1891, was to print another short story of Sherlock Holmes called A Scandal in Bohemia. This started a long-running relationship for Conan Doyle with the magazine. In the same year, Conan Doyle moved his family from near to the British Museum to South Norwood. At this time, he had a daughter, Mary, who was born in 1889. Later, he would have a son who was affectionately known as Kingsley. Although his first name was Arthur, he would be born in 1892. By 1893, Conan Doyle had had enough of Sherlock Holmes and planned to kill off his famous detective. It was while travelling to Switzerland on a lecture tour that he came up with what was then to be the final Sherlock Holmes story called The Final Problem. He got his idea for the story while visiting Reichenbach Falls. You may remember this place from the famous scene between Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes. Unfortunately, audiences reacted very badly to the death of Sherlock Holmes. The story made the headlines around the world at the same time as the public were mourning for the loss of Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle was to receive some tragic news. His wife, Louisa, was diagnosed with tuberculosis. She was given only a few months to live, although she would go on to live another 13 years. At this time, Conan Doyle also lost his father. Whilst Conan Doyle wasn't writing Sherlock Holmes stories, he was busy with his other writing work, writing the autobiographical Stark Munro letters and the Brigadier Gerard novels that began in 1894 and was published in the Strand magazine. In 1897, Conan Doyle was to meet Jean Leckie, who was a formerly trained opera singer. She would later become his second wife. Not long after meeting Jean, he embarked on a play for Sherlock Holmes with the same name. In 1901, he wrote the famous The Hound of the Baskervilles. The Strand offered Conan Doyle a substantial amount of money to keep writing the Sherlock Holmes stories, which he accepted. The stories included The Empty House, where Sherlock Holmes returns. Unfortunately, Louisa died of tuberculosis in 1906. In the year after, in 1907, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle married Jean. They moved to Sussex, and shortly after, in 1909 and 1910, Conan Doyle had 2 more sons called Dennis and Adrian. He was to write the famous The Lost World in 1912, and also in the same year had a second daughter with Jean, also called Jean. Although Conan Doyle had fought during the Boer War, when he said that he wanted to fight in the First World War, his application was rejected. Unfortunately for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, his beloved son Kingsley sustained injuries in fighting in the Battle of the Somme. He died in 1918 from influenza. At around the same time, Conan Doyle also lost his brother Innes. It's not surprising then in later years, Conan Doyle turned more and more to spiritualism. By 1927, the final Sherlock Holmes stories were to be published. This was called the CaseBook of Sherlock Holmes and included stories such as The Adventure of the Three Gables and The Problem of Thor Bridge. Conan Doyle died at his home in Sussex on the 7th of July 1930, although Sherlock Holmes remains ever popular to this day with readers worldwide. The famous detective is his legacy. If you would like to know more about the life of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, then I recommend reading Teller of Tales, The Life of Arthur Conan Doyle by Daniel Stashower. It is a great resource and I read it before recording this podcast. I will also shortly be putting up an essay of this podcast, which will also include a little quiz on Sherlock Holmes. This will be available on my Buy Me a Coffee page. After recording this podcast, I realised that there is so much more to talk about on the topic of the life of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, including his beliefs in spiritualism. I would like to do more episodes such as these. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so via our Buy Me a Coffee page. It's buymeacoffee.com/curl up with a cozy crime novel. You can also visit my blog, which is Curl Up with a Cozy Crime Novel, www.curlupwithacozycrimenovel.wordpress.com. Thank you for listening. You have been listening to Curl Up with a Crime Author, and I've been Sarah Campbell. You can tune in again for more episodes about great crime authors. Until then, speak to you soon. Take care. Goodbye.